My name is Biddulph. I'm from Cardiff University, and I have been looking at how people use streets. So in a sense, a straightforward presentation of some research results. And it's worth saying that it was part funded by the Urban Design Group, which I was very appreciative of. I'm going to start with a document we've already referred to today, Manual for Streets. Manual for Streets is a good document from my perspective because it reminds us that streets are for things other than parking and driving and passing through. Slightly unfortunate is this illustration in design terms because it tells us only that, and I think a little bit incorrectly, that first of all the cars are still on the roads, and then we can design a footway, and if we design a little bit more space, people might stay and chat, and if we design a bit more wider still, people might play. But the intention is there, and I think that sort of sets off a whole agenda for me in terms of things I'm interested in. I'm interested in all sorts of things that might improve streets, and I'm focusing principally on residential streets, which is a nice complement to the session earlier today on shared space. There's a campaign always to try and reduce speed limits on residential streets, get them down to 20 miles an hour, sorry. And that reduces the likelihood of accidents, we know that. But it doesn't really change the way streets are used, at least that's all the evidence we've got so far. Sometimes it's inferred or suggested when arguments about creating 20-mile-an-hour zones are put forward. As far as I know, there's little evidence. And in 1999, work was done on the introduction of 20-mile-an-hour zones, and the conclusion was there was so far little impact on the function of streets in the zone. So we know that we can traffic calm, but it'll slow the cars down, it'll make the streets safer, but we're not sure if it'll change the way that streets are used. During the 1990s, I was very involved in and interested in the introduction of home zones across the UK, and this is a slightly different set of ideas which involves traffic calming and putting a whole set of features together to try and change the way that streets are used. And one of the things I wanted to explore in my work was whether the streets were used differently. So in some respects I'm comparing streets that predate Manual for Streets with streets like this, seeing how they're used. So this is what I was looking at. Do Manual for Streets compliant designs result in different patterns of activity in residential streets as compared to, for example, the previous guidance, Design Bulletin 32, for residential roads in particular. So this is what I did. I compared 7 recently designed schemes with 3 Design Bulletin or older schemes. And we did some observation work over the summer, during the summer holidays, when we thought the kids would be out playing, because obviously we're interested in particular in possibly how children use the streets. And they were across the UK, they're not just in London, and I'm going to refer to some of the results from some of the schemes, not all of them. We went to the streets, but the schemes, and we recorded what they were like in design terms and how they were sort of put together in design terms. We looked at where people park the car to get a sense of the physical environment. But then it's probably a little bit hard to see, but we started to break down how we might observe these streets in a kind of, it's what we academics call the coding, if you like, slightly boring term. But we wanted to look at how different types of people, children, young children, children between the age of about 5 and 12, teenagers, adults, and the elderly people, how they were using the streets. So we looked at trying to categorise those. We looked at whether they were there briefly, i.e. just passing through, as most of us tend to in a street, or whether they would stay for a while. We weren't timing them, so we just sort of said, a few minutes, for example, pausing, or whether they were there for an extended period of time. And then we looked at, using Gell's criteria, actually, whether they were just passing through, or whether they were doing other things, whether they were playing, hanging out. Those were the things that we tended to observe. We also rather optimistically thought they might sit, lie, eat. We didn't see any of that, in fact, in the entire time that we were there. So basically looking for playing and hanging out. And then we looked at whether there was any resulting social activity, whether they chatted, whether there was any observation of other people. And this is basically it. We went around, we went to all of the schemes and we did the same process of looking at each individual event in the street over the 6-hour period. And then also mapping where the people went as well to get some kind of line of movement. I was also interested in trying to use cameras to record street life as well. I couldn't do this in all the schemes because some of the schemes are very complicated and residential schemes have all sorts of corners and and I wanted to get a complete overview. But I was inspired by William H. White's work in downtown Manhattan, where he records elements of street life. I didn't have his resource or his money. I had some sandwich boxes, which I painted grey using paint, and I put some time-lapse cameras in those boxes and attached them onto lampposts. Subsequently, I found that this was illegal. Or that I didn't get the residents. I don't have to get their permission, but I have to tell them I was doing it. But I didn't want to actually affect what people were doing in the street. I wanted to be anonymous, or really not there at all. But anyway, this is a fabulous way of recording the street life in essentially long, straight environments. And some part of this presentation will be some of the films, if the room will allow it. I tend to think it won't, but of what we see in these streets. They took pictures every 7 seconds and pieced together they represent a film. And I tended to put these up for a 24-hour period. And so I've got films from 24 hours. I tended to just analyse 6 hours of that at a time. The results of the whole thing, the 10 streets, are in this document, which you can download over the web. It's called The Impact of Innovative Designs on Activity in Residential Streets. And so the key conclusions are in there. And if you just search for my name and streets, it should come up. Well, these were my conclusions. I thought I'd put them in the middle when you're still awake. That what I found was that essentially the home zones, or the more recent streets, far outperformed the other streets in terms of how they're used by people, which I thought was a good result. That they tended to be used by reasonably small groups of children, but for long periods of time, as you might expect. When we were introducing the home zones, there was lots of ideas that lots of kids from outside would come in and start taking over the streets. None of that actually materialises in practice. And that in these kinds of streets, that adults will spend more time in the streets, but only really a while. They won't spend a long time. We're time poor, aren't we? And we don't have time to hang around in streets. This is just a myth, really. But they do engage with their kids, so they're slightly more social. We saw lots of teenagers. They were all passing through. We know this intuitively. Teenagers don't hang outside their parents' houses chatting. They're going off to other locations. And we didn't really see many elderly people either. And this might just reflect the nature of the environments we were studying. There's nothing we can really extrapolate from that in particular. The older schemes were little used by play for children, despite the fact, for example, some of them were cul-de-sacs. I deliberately chose cul-de-sacs because people often say cul-de-sacs are places where kids will play. And where there was any kind of evidence of play, it was very restricted in terms of what the kids did. And some of the films are about just that, in a sense. We'll see what we can find in the films. And that in certain older streets, there was a lot of necessary activity, but only in the non-cul-de-sacs. Basically, where there were cul-de-sacs, the activity, including coming and going, seemed to have been designed out. So when you're looking at 6 hours of film of a street, even one person walking down the street going home is a delight. Often there was nothing going on at all. A lot of the schemes that were the new schemes were very conservative, actually, in their design. They were not exciting schemes. You wouldn't go out and take pictures of them and say these are great schemes in terms of design, but the people were living in them in a very full way. And so I kind of came to the conclusion, at least from the evidence that I had, that speed limits or traffic calming alone cannot be upheld as methods to promote a change in use or activity. We need to combine other methods together in a slightly more interesting way. Just to go through the cases, this is Page Drive. This is typical suburbia. It's a classic, well, I don't need to tell you this, you're all urban designers. Fantastic. It's got some traffic calming in it. It's a cul-de-sac. And this is what happened during a 6-hour period. In fact, not very much happened in it at all. If you think 6 hours during the summer holidays, you'd expect quite a lot of coming and going. I wasn't measuring people coming and going in cars. There are a few key things. Down here, we can see the adults. I'm not going to dwell on these too much, but only 6 adults walk down the street in a 6-hour period, so not much happening at all. And here the children, 4 children are there briefly, and they're just passing through. No children are there for longer than 3 minutes. This is the quietest street. This is the street in plan. It's a cul-de-sac. It's relatively isolated, so we might expect not much passing through, but I would expect a few people to come and go. The only event which was really exciting or interesting or illuminating, I mapped. Here it is. Oops, sorry. Let's just go back. It's a little walk that a toddler takes with her grandmother, and this is the only event in a 6-hour period in the street. I don't know if, hopefully you might get a sense of it. It's just an anecdote in a sense. Similar street in some respects, but this is a through route. And little things suddenly became very significant in these kinds of environments. This has got a connection through for pedestrians going to some shops, and it immediately has a big impact on how the street is used, typically by adults passing through. So in 6-hour periods, 88 adults passed through this scheme, but nobody stayed in this environment longer, either children, teenagers. Again, so it wasn't really performing in a very exciting way. Another film, see how this one goes. The only thing that happened in this street in a 6-hour period was a little girl came out on her bike. We could film her, and she did a circle on her bike 7 times. And this is the route that she took, around and around and around and around, a bit like a gerbil on a wheel, really, in some respects. And I found this quite interesting because it was quite limited in terms of the space that she used, and very repetitive in some respects. This is, though, a more recent scheme. This is Gun Wharf in Plymouth, very nice scheme. We can see a complete change in the nature of the environment and other design ideas at work here. This is a shared surface scheme, shared space scheme. It's actually shared surface as well, and it's home zone. And if we actually map the nature of the activity over a 6-hour period, this is what the map looks like. This is essentially children playing. They play it across the extent of particularly the central space, which is a distinctive feature of this scheme, but they're also coming up and down to the beach at the end. There's a little beach here at the end, and they are using the environment with a lot of liberty, it has to be said. And if we look at what they're doing all sorts of things. It's probably a bit small for your screen, but they're doing all the things that kids do. They're riding bikes, they're hanging out, they're climbing on stairs and street furniture, they're wandering down to the beach and trying to throw their sisters in. I'm not sure. There's a little boy here, you can't really see him, he's kissing his football. Just, the idea this is what kids do. We can't design for it, but we can make it easier for them to. So in this respect, in a 6-hour period, a lot more happening at the same kind of period. This is Lime Tree Square. It pops up quite a lot for its architecture. I was interested in how it's used socially. And this is the map for Lime Tree Square, 6-hour period observation of what's going on. The central square here, this is a large central square with apartments and housing around the outside, is extensively used by kids for hanging out. There are garages which are around the space on the housing, and the parents open up the garage and the kids take their wheeled toys out, things like that, and they come and go. And interestingly as well, the kids go in wide loops around the connected streets within the scheme. So again, there's a fair amount of liberty in that scheme as well. It's quite well used. If I pulled all of the schemes together, it gets a bit small, I know, but over here we can see the percentage of, these are the home zones, and this is kind of how the activity is split between the different schemes. If you look in the report, you'll see these sort of graphs explained a little bit better. But the dark colours here just indicate the amount of time that kids spend, or the people spend, in the schemes. And here we can see that children, and preschool children in particular, the majority of them spend a long time in the schemes. And the adults as well, this is the darker colour, spending a while, quite a significant proportion of adults and teenagers spending a while in the schemes as well. And we can compare that with the other streets down at the bottom where, for example, a small proportion, but not many children in comparison to the top, are spending longer in the streets. And if you're interested in the social life of streets, then that's kind of a result, I suppose. If you look at what they're doing as well, it's a little bit of a detail as well, but here are the kids, and it's maybe hard to see, but the darker blue colour here is playing. And it's a much greater proportion than you actually get in the other streets as well. So we can say essentially that the more recent schemes with the more radical features in some respects see more active play and hanging out. I just want to finish on it's a scheme that has been recently renewed, and it was a bylaw street, and there's some social housing being built around it, and it has some gate posts. I don't know if you can see that. I was expecting the slides to be much bigger. And it's got some trees, and it's got paving. Quite unspectacular, very affordable. When you go into it, it's a cul-de-sac for cars. Pedestrians can go through it. And the kids have drawn a goalpost. It starts to speak reams about how the street might be used. And it was by far and away the busiest street. It also had quite a few cars going through it, actually, quite interestingly. There were quite a lot of adults coming and going, 94. Quite a few children passing through as well, 32. But 13 kids spent, I think, about 3.5 hours in the street during the same 6-hour period. So if you compare that with a child going for a small walk or for a girl going around on a bike, 13 kids playing in the street for such a long time is quite a significant difference. And this is where they were. This is a map of the street. It's quite significant in some respects because it's only one end of the street which has been treated and the other end of the street is not used at all. So the kids are taking something from the design of the street. And most importantly, there's a turning circle in the middle of the street. So a lot of the cars, even though there are more cars coming into the street than some of the others, a lot of them turn in the middle and drive out again. You can still drive through to the end. This is a film of the street. I'm not even going to try and play it there. And this shows a 2.5-hour period in the evening. Now, this film's actually on the web, so if you want to have a look at it, and it's compared with a neighbouring street where nothing happens at all. And there are 13 kids playing in the street constantly across its width, hanging out, doing what kids do. At the end of the street, there are 6 children playing football. At this end of the street, there are 7 kids riding bikes, lying down, chatting, playing ball, whatever it is. Fortunately, it does start to rain. Quite a difference from the film of the children, or the play that children had before. So I found a very positive story from the new guidance, that we don't need to create very radical designs to create quite a big change in how the streets can be used, in particular by children. That for them in particular it creates a lot of liberty and some degree of joy as well, I would hope. Okay, thank you very much.